All right, so the last couple weeks we have gone through who wrote the Bible, looking at the Old Testament, the New Testament, all these different kind of authorships, how it was put together. So this week and the next week we're going to look at, okay, how did the books of the Bible get to be the Bible? Starting with the Old Testament or Hebrew Bible. So, how are all these books gathered together to form our Bible? As with most things, it's a complicated story, and we don't know all the details. We do know, however, that these books were not recognized as part of the Bible when they were first written. Authors did not set out to write books that would be a part of some large holy book. They weren't thinking, all right, I'm going to write this, it's going to be in a Bible, and people are going to care about this for a really long time. That wasn't on their minds at the time. They were written before the Bible even existed, or the thought of the Bible existed. The authors would probably be surprised to find out what happened to their book, their writings, their letters. Oftentimes they wrote letters just to a group. You often don't think of your letters being published for the world. So at the same time, some books or parts were written to have some kind of special status for the community. We know that the biblical canon did not come about all at once. It was a gradual process. The Bible grew in stages over the course of several centuries. And we can identify two main phases in this process. First, individual books were used throughout the years in teaching and worship. This happened both in the Jewish community for the books that became the Hebrew Bible, what we call the Old Testament, and the Christian community for those books that became the New Testament. As these books were used, they became more and more important and revered by the community. Second, at various times and places, these books were officially recognized as canon, that is, Bible, but we do not know exactly how or when. There are only a few details available. They didn't keep meticulous records of all these things. So we'll start with the Old Testament. So the Old Testament books, as we talked a couple weeks ago, were written over many centuries. Often different people wrote things, and a later editor would say, okay, this is good, I'm going to mash these together, add a little bit of my own flair, there you go. The last book written was written around 165 BCE, or BC, and that's the book of Daniel. Now, this is just taking in kind of the Protestant Old Testament. If you throw the Apocrypha in there and you consider it part of the Old Testament, that changes. But really, the Apocrypha is called intertestamental books. So, last book of the Old Testament, 165 BC, book of Daniel. Now, what's interesting about the book of Daniel, it's written about the time when the Israelites were in exile and Persia was kind of ruling over them. Well, at the time it was actually written, Israel was kind of under the control of the Seleucids. When Alexander the Great died, he divided his empire into three. And Seleucids were one, Ptolemies in Egypt, all that stuff. So Seleucids kind of took over Israel. And that's when you have the time of the Maccabean revolt happening. So the Israelites are upset with the Seleucids, all the things they're doing, their empire, their control. So they write about what's happening then by writing about the past and another time a foreign empire had control. So they're shining a light on their present by being creative about their past. So even though the book of Daniel seems like it's written during the time of exile in the Persian Empire, it's actually written much later. Does that make sense? Sometimes you write about the past to speak about the present. Sometimes you write about the future to speak about the present. Book of Revelation is that. It's talking about a future time, but really it's talking about what was then their present. So why each book of the Old Testament was written is not clear, but over time they have come to have value for the community. How and when these books became canonical are uncertain too, but the Bible's creation must be considered a process over time rather than a single event. It's like, boom, Bible. No. Scholars commonly speak of three key stages at which community decisions are made regarding certain books. At the same time, our evidence for these three stages is minimal, so there wasn't a lot of fanfare when these developments took place. No big ribbon cutting, no big PR event having all the news channels there. So first stage is the law, or Torah. It's the Pentateuch, Genesis through Deuteronomy, those first 5 books of the Bible. That was probably first recognized as Holy Scripture by around 400 BCE or so. So this may be the book of the law of Moses, publicly recognized in Nehemiah chapter 8 and a few other texts. So when the people come back from exile, Nehemiah talks about the book of the law of Moses. That was probably this first 5 books. If you remember, some of that was probably written, 900 BCE. And then editors did it around 400, put the pieces together, and that's when it probably becomes Torah. They had bits of the law before that, the 10 Commandments passing through, but they didn't have, as much of the Torah scroll. And even in the Bible, where it talks about the people in Exodus carrying it with them, you add it back because you want to say what's important now was actually important then too. We do that all the time with stuff. As we make things more important, we kind of play that back into our history and overemphasize. Like, no one actually cared about the Pilgrims at Plymouth until Thanksgiving became a national holiday. Then it was like, oh, this is really important. No one cared before that. It was completely forgotten for the most part. But then we retell our story, and now the Pilgrims and Plymouth and all of that's this key part of the story. But that's a newer development in the grand scheme of things. So you have the law first. Then you have the prophets. These books consisted of Joshua through 2 Kings, except for Ruth, often called the former prophets, and the latter prophets, Isaiah, Jeremiah, Ezekiel, or sometimes called the major prophets, then the minor prophets. These books were probably recognized as scripture by 200 BCE, so 200 years later. The New Testament occasionally refers to the law and the prophets. So Matthew talks about that. If you remember from last week, Matthew's writing for a primarily Jewish audience. So he's really wanting to emphasize the connection between Jesus and his message and the Hebrew scriptures. So he's constantly saying this was done in accordance with the scriptures or according to the law and the prophets. So there was a sense, at least then, that this idea of the law and the prophets was a thing. Now, different communities might have had different books that they saw as authoritative, but there was some sense of all of that. Because even Matthew is quoting Isaiah and Hosea in different times, and people recognized it. So it's clear a large contingent of people are aware of most of these major prophetic books by the time Matthew writes, maybe around 100 CE or AD. So law, prophets added in probably around 200 BCE or BC. So if you don't know, BCE means before Common Era. BC is the old way before Christ. So typically in scholarly circles, you use BCE and CE. The third was be the writings. These remaining Old Testament books were written later. This section remained undefined till 90 to 100 CE. So after Jesus, more than 60 years after Jesus' death. Again, this is a gradual process with some, perhaps many of these books, especially the Psalms, already had a lot of importance, just weren't canonized so much. Like, people quoted the Psalms, but you didn't see them in the language having as much authority as the law and the prophets. So they weren't really completely added into this kind of canon of authoritative works until after Jesus' death, after the temple is destroyed. So for a long time in Jewish faith, the temple is the center of their faith. Everything revolves around it. But when the temple is destroyed again in 70 CE, and they're not able to rebuild it, they need something else to really kind of bring the people together. And that's a good time to say, all right, we're going to revolve around this book, these scriptures, these scrolls, and make that the key instead of the building, the place of God's presence. So then you start seeing Rabbinical Judaism take a higher stand, and there you have these canonical scriptures in use in synagogues. They don't have the temple as that main place anymore. So that's why you really see that development in 90 to 100 CE. Sometime in the latter part of the first century, the Jewish community in Palestine places its seal of approval on the present 39 books of the Hebrew Bible. This development recognized the stature that these books, one by one, had already attained during the earlier years. So again, people were reading these books. these scrolls. It just didn't get kind of put into, here's our Holy Scripture, until that time. And again, not every community recognized the same books. You have the community in Qumran with the Dead Sea Scrolls have other scrolls that were really important to them. But often is what happens, eventually one branch of power, of faith, of community ends up taking more hold, and their way kind of just gets taken in by everybody. So the Christian church, of course, is not bound by Jewish decisions, and portions of this third section of the canon remain somewhat loosely defined for Christians for many years. That the book of Daniel was included among the writings in the Jewish canon and the prophets in the Christian canon may reflect a difference of opinion between Christian and Jews about its dating or prophetic character. And then the New Testament books often quote the Old Testament or allude to it. More than 2,000 references have been claimed. This practice indicates that these books, or at least many of them, had a highly valued status for the New Testament community. Commonly, references to these books are not offhand. Rather, the Old Testament is cited to ground arguments. For example, in Romans, Paul writes, as it is written. And if you remember, Paul was writing these letters before the Gospels had even been published. So the earliest kind of Christian writings we have are Paul, and he's making references to these authoritative Jewish scriptures, because again, he was a highly educated Jewish scholar, religious man, Pharisee. Then you have claims about the inspired status of the existing Old Testament, making clear that these books held a high status for the communities. A clear example would be 1 Corinthians 10:11 and its references to the wilderness stories in Numbers as written for our instruction. So clearly, even early in Christian faith, pointing back to the key, the value, the importance of these older writings. So the extent of the Old Testament canon gains clarity only through the years, but much of it is understood to have such authority from the earliest Christian times, not least because of the understanding that the Old Testament, or at least the bulk of it, had authoritative status for Jesus and these New Testament writers. So as the Christian community is expanding, they see that these early writers of the New Testament, the Gospels, Paul, they valued these works, and Jesus quoted these works, or at least the Gospel writers purported Jesus quoted these works. So then they have value as well. Questions, comments, snide remarks? I don't know. Which kind of Bible? Oh, the Catholic Bible has what's called the Apocrypha. It's books kind of written between that last book of the Old Testament, Daniel, and the Gospels. So you have things like Tobit, 1st and 2nd Maccabees. So it kind of takes place during this time between 165 and 30 AD. So the Catholics had that Apocrypha in there. There's some interesting books in there. Sirach is one of them. So yeah, those are considered intertestamental books because they're not either officially in the New Testament or the Old Testament. Pam.
So for the Old Testament, I guess I'm curious, thinking about, at some point they said, all right, this is the Old Testament, and why is there ever any movements to add additional?
Not now. I mean, you could have maybe a small group, but because even Judaism, it's so fractured. Then Christianity, think of all the different Christians. Can you imagine, even if we found a book, the Gospel of whatever, and we can date it, it's clear it's from, the 1st century, it seems to really jive with things that's already in the Bible, it offers newness. There's no way we could get it added because everyone would have such disagreements. So we might have a Presbyterian Bible and a Methodist Bible. And at some point, the way humans work, for right or for wrong, is once you kind of have a traditional thing, it's a hard road to change that. It's like, well, this is our thing. These are the songs we sing at Christmas. Do not introduce any new hymns to our Christmas Eve service, or else we do it this way. So it'd be really hard to add at this point because it's so far afterwards what's legit, what's not legit, and getting all the Christian communities or all the Jewish communities to all sign off and say, yes, this is authoritative. In theory, could it happen? Yes. Will it happen? Probably not at this point.
But going back to that, 400 to 500 CE,
Yeah, so you have all these politicking back and forth. So just like the classic Hamilton song, "The Room Where It Happened," you have some backroom shady deals. So there are certain books that some people didn't want in. And there were some that Christians didn't want in the Old Testament because they said, well, these books, they're kind of a bummer. There's a guy named Marcion who didn't want to even have the Old Testament at all. Let's just forget that and just have kind of these newer books. You have Asia Minor Christians really latching on to the Gospel of John and the Johannine writings because they were written more in that area, so they had more access to it. They didn't always have Matthew, Mark, and Luke. So the churches over kind of the more eastern, western side, they had Matthew, Mark, Luke. Like, that's all we need. But the Asia Minor church is like, whoa, wait a minute. We like John. That's what we've been reading. We're not just going to forget about him. So if you're not signing on this, we're not signing off on your thing. And so there's a lot of give and take there. And it happens in different councils, and there are some minutes from the meetings, but as you know from session minutes, you don't always get the full discussion, but you get a little bit. And some people wrote some stuff, so we have a little bit of that. So next week, we can chat a little bit more about some of those New Testament debates. Like Martin Luther, even with the Reformation, there were some books he was like, I don't think this should be in Scripture. He really hated the Song of Songs, or called the Song of Solomon. He wanted that out. Esther was a big one. Does that go in or not? Esther never actually mentions God a single time in the entire book. So some people are like, well, Esther, we don't need that in. Jonah almost didn't make the cut. So lots of different books at times were on the chopping block. So you have these bubble teams, like in the NCAA tournament, of are they going to get in or are they not? So we have a little bit more about New Testament canon, because again, it's later, more writings in the language, less about the debates with Hebrew Scripture. But there are clearly other Hebrew Scripture books that are somewhat authoritative to Jews. I have a whole book called the Pseudepigrapha that has a bunch of other kind of important texts for Jewish faith that aren't in the Bible. And then there's a whole bunch of Gnostic Gospels and other writings that are interesting to learn about, but aren't part of the New Testament. We've talked about those in different classes, why they aren't in, and all of that. And that'll be another question for later in this series. Why didn't some books make it in?
It's probably political.
Oh, yeah, always. I mean, people have their thing. You do this for me, I'll do this for you.
Thousands of years ago, but it was probably just political like it is today.
Yep, I want my gospel in, so...
Rules and regulations.
Yep, that's always how it works.
Excuse me, where does King James Version come into all of these?
So that's a translation, 1611. The king says, hey, make this a translation for the Bible, because now it's getting more popular to have the vernacular. I want an official version. So they get people to translate. They translate it off of the Greek Septuagint, so that's already not a great translation. So the King James has a lot of pretty language. Is it the most accurate Bible? No, not at all. It has a lot of bad translations in it. But for the time, it was an important vernacular text, very beautiful poetic language, but they kind of emphasized the artistic nature of the Scripture, and they started from not the best authentic translation to begin with. So there's a lot of kind of
That's when I was growing up,
Oh, yeah, that was always.
That's the best.
Some churches will only believe the King James Version is the authoritative version. There's no reason to think that whatsoever, but again, it's tradition. This is what we had. The king wrote, the king gave us his stamp of approval, it must be the best. And it goes with divine right and all that stuff. But yeah, there's a lot of mistakes in it, but it has very pretty language and all that. But it's that traditional text many people used for a really long time.
So any Bible we're using is fine.
Depending on which one you use it for. There are some translations that aren't that good. And as Marty said, everything's political. So you have to know the translation you're using and all that. Now that's going to be a whole other class coming up on translations and different ones and what ones are good and bad and for what purpose. So I don't want to go too far into that. But we will have a whole couple weeks just on translations and why there's differences and all that stuff. So we'll wait to get to that. All right. Thank you very much.
Thank you.